Margaret sat at her kitchen table, staring at the old, yellowed photograph in her hands. The woman in the picture was a younger version of herself, smiling with bright eyes and a sense of purpose she had long since lost. Her fingers traced the edges of the photograph, the creases in the paper mirroring the creases on her skin. The house was quiet, too quiet. Her husband, Jack, had passed away years ago, and her daughter, Emily, lived on the other side of the country, busy with her own life. Margaret hadn't seen her in months. She didn't want to admit it, but sometimes, it felt like Emily had forgotten her, just like the rest of the world seemed to have forgotten about people like her. Once, she had been a nurse, saving lives, making a difference. Now, the closest she came to helping was when she volunteered at the local senior center, but even there, the younger generation didn't seem to want her input. It was as if she had become irrelevant, a relic of the past, her voice fading into the background. She glanced out the window at the tree in the front yard, its leaves turning from green to gold, a symbol of the seasons changing, of time marching on. Was this all there was? She felt the weight of it all, the weight of her own aging body, the weight of missed opportunities, the weight of regret. She stood and walked to the counter to pour herself a cup of tea, the familiar motion comforting, yet heavy. The arthritis in her knees flared up as she moved, and she winced, gritting her teeth against the pain. She used to be able to run with ease, climb stairs without hesitation. Now, even walking around the block was a challenge. Her mind wandered to the recent doctor's visit where her physician had told her to slow down. That was it. No advice, no motivation. Just a polite suggestion that her best days were behind her. Her heart sank at the thought. Was this really how it was supposed to end? A slow decline, a quiet fade into nothing. She took her tea to the living room and sat in her favorite chair, the one she had inherited from her mother. The chair creaked as she settled into it, the worn fabric a reminder of years gone by. She picked up her phone, scrolling through the news feed, not really expecting to find anything of interest. But then a headline caught her eye: Neuralink, Elon Musk's vision for the future of healthcare. The words leaped out at her, and for the first time in a long while, something inside her stirred. Neuralink. It sounded like science fiction. It sounded like something that had nothing to do with her, an old woman whose only battle these days was with the limitations of her aging body. But something about the headline, something about the name Elon Musk, grabbed her attention. She clicked the link and began reading about the latest advancements in brain-computer interfaces and how Neuralink aimed to revolutionize healthcare. The idea that technology could cure neurological disorders, restore lost memories, and even improve cognitive function seemed almost too good to be true. She wasn't exactly tech-savvy, but she understood the basics. And what she was reading made her feel like a spark had been lit in her chest. Could this really be the answer? Could this technology help people like her, people whose minds were still sharp, but whose bodies were betraying them? She clicked on another article, this one showing a video of Elon Musk talking about the potential of Neuralink to treat conditions like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and even paralysis. His words were bold, confident, and full of promise. The future, he said in his usual direct manner, is not something that happens. It's something you create. Margaret paused the video and replayed the sentence, feeling the weight of it settle in her chest. The future was something you create. She hadn't thought about it that way before. It had always seemed like the future was something that happened to her. It was something she had no control over. But Musk's words planted a seed in her mind. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe there was still something she could do. Margaret had always been a woman of action. When she was younger, she had dreamed of becoming a leading surgeon, someone who would change the world of medicine. But life had a way of redirecting plans, and when Jack fell ill, she had put her dreams aside to care for him. She had loved him dearly, but it had been hard. He had needed more help than she could give, and the toll it took on her was immense. In the end, it felt like everything she had worked for was lost. Her career, her health, her dreams, gone. She had poured herself into nursing, believing it was her calling. But after Jack's death, and with Emily so far away, she had been left with nothing but memories and unanswered questions. Could she still have a future? Could she still contribute to the world in a meaningful way? Margaret sat back in her chair, her tea now forgotten. Her mind raced as she thought about everything she had just read. Neuralink. Brain-computer interfaces. It all seemed so futuristic, so far beyond her reach. But what if it wasn't? What if there was something she could do? She didn't know where to begin, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was a sign. Maybe it wasn't too late for her to learn something new, to find a new purpose. Maybe it was time to stop seeing herself as someone who was over the hill, and start seeing herself as someone who could still change the world. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the excitement bubble up inside her. She reached for her phone again, determined to find out more about this technology. She would learn, she told herself. She would start reading, start exploring, start thinking about what this could mean for her and others like her. She could make a difference. As she typed in a search for Neuralink, a thought crossed her mind: what if this is the beginning of something new? And for the first time in years, Margaret smiled. The future wasn't something that happened to her. It was something she could create. What if everything you believed about getting old was wrong? That was the thought that had just come to her. She wasn't sure where it came from, but it felt right. Margaret realized that this wasn't the end for her. This was just the beginning. She wasn't ready to fade into obscurity. She wasn't ready to stop fighting for a future that included her. The world was changing, and maybe it was time for her to change with it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Margaret's heart raced as she stared at the computer screen. She had spent the better part of the morning reading about Neuralink, Elon Musk's company that was pioneering the future of brain-computer interfaces. The more she read, the more the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fit together. It wasn't just about curing diseases, it was about reshaping the way people thought about aging, about limitations, about possibilities. She had spent years feeling like an afterthought, someone whose time had come and gone. But now, for the first time in ages, she felt a sense of excitement, a flicker of hope that had eluded her for so long. Neuralink wasn't just a company making headlines for its breakthroughs in medicine, it was a symbol of change, of innovation, of the kind of thinking that could defy even the most stubborn laws of nature. Could it help people like her? Could it give her a chance to start over, to reclaim the life she had put on hold? The thought felt wild, but for the first time, it didn't seem impossible. Margaret's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She could feel the weight of time on her shoulders, the years that had slipped by, but she refused to let them define her. She had seen others give up, fall into the trap of believing they were too old to change. But Margaret wasn't ready to go quietly into that good night. She refused to accept that aging meant stagnation. With a deep breath, she clicked on a link to a forum for people interested in emerging medical technologies, particularly Neuralink. She wasn't sure what to expect, but the idea of connecting with others who shared her curiosity and passion filled her with a sense of purpose. Within minutes, she was reading posts from people all over the world, some in their 20s, some in their 40s, and others who, like her, were in their 60s or 70s. The excitement was palpable. The more she read, the more she realized that there was a community of people who were just as fascinated by the potential of technology to change lives as she was. There were stories of people who had lived with neurological conditions for years and were hopeful that Neuralink could offer a solution. Some shared their own experiences with aging, others discussed how advancements like Neuralink could transform the healthcare system. One post, in particular, stood out. It was from someone named Thomas, a retired engineer in his 70s, who wrote about how he had spent most of his life working in the technology sector but had been sidelined as he aged. He had felt invisible, his skills and knowledge overlooked. But when he read about Neuralink, he saw a chance to apply his expertise in a new way. He talked about how he was learning more about the technology, attending online seminars, and even experimenting with building small neural interfaces in his own garage. "It's never too late to learn something new," he wrote. "The only thing holding you back is your willingness to step outside your comfort zone." Margaret stared at the words for a long time. She felt a surge of inspiration. Here was a man, older than her, who was still embracing the future with both hands, still learning, still growing. He wasn't letting age dictate what he could or couldn't do. If Thomas could do it, why couldn't she? She felt a sudden wave of clarity. This wasn't just about Neuralink or brain-computer interfaces. This was about breaking free from the limitations she had imposed on herself. It was about reclaiming her life, about doing something that mattered, no matter her age. Margaret leaned forward, her hands shaking slightly as she typed her first post in the forum. "Hi, my name is Margaret. I'm a retired nurse, and I've recently become fascinated by the possibilities of Neuralink and the ways it might transform healthcare. I've spent most of my life in medicine, but now, in my 60s, I feel like there's so much more I could be doing. I'm just starting to learn more about this technology, and I'd love to connect with others who are also exploring it. I want to know how I can contribute, what I can do to be part of this movement." She hit post, then sat back, her heart pounding in her chest. It was out there. She had taken the first step. Margaret felt a mix of excitement and fear. She wasn't used to putting herself out there, especially not in a world that often overlooked people like her. But something about this felt different. She wasn't just writing about a passing interest, she was writing about a new chapter in her life, a chapter she was determined to write. The responses started coming in almost immediately. Some were from people her age, others much younger, but they all shared a sense of urgency, a desire to understand the potential of this new frontier. One person wrote, "Margaret, you're not alone in feeling like time is running out. But the truth is, we're all in this together." Neuralink is just one example of how technology is reshaping what we think is possible. It's exciting to see people like you getting involved. Another wrote, "I think you're onto something. It's never too late to start. I'm in my 70s, and I've spent the last few years studying AI and its applications in healthcare. There's so much out there, and you've got the experience in healthcare that can really make a difference." The more she read, the more she felt a sense of belonging. It was as if the world had opened up to her in a way she hadn't imagined possible. And in that moment, Margaret knew that this wasn't just about learning about Neuralink, it was about finding her place in a world that was changing rapidly, a world that still had space for people like her, no matter their age. But even with all this new excitement, doubts lingered. Was it really possible to make a difference at her age? Could she really catch up with the cutting-edge technology and contribute something meaningful? The skepticism she had carried for so long crept back in. She had seen too many people in her generation who had given up, who had stopped trying because they thought they were too old, too out of touch. What made her any different? It was then that she remembered something Elon Musk had said in one of his interviews, something that had stuck with her: the future belongs to those who can look at problems and say, "I'm going to solve that." Margaret's eyes sparkled as she recalled his words. She could solve problems. She had been doing it her whole life as a nurse, even if those problems were on a smaller scale. But the scale didn't matter. What mattered was that she was still capable. What mattered was her willingness to step into the unknown and find solutions where others saw only obstacles. She grabbed her notebook and began jotting down ideas. She didn't know exactly how she would contribute, but the possibilities seemed endless. She could take what she had learned as a nurse and apply it to the world of technology. She could become an advocate for older people in healthcare, pushing for innovations that would make a tangible difference in their lives. And, just maybe, she could inspire others to think differently about aging, about technology, about the future. Margaret knew it wouldn't be easy. It was one thing to read about breakthroughs in neuroscience and another to understand them at a deep level. But she wasn't afraid of the work. She had spent her life learning, adapting, helping. She was ready to learn again. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she wasn't just looking for answers in technology, she was looking for a way to live again, to find purpose, to prove that even at 60-something, she still had something to offer the world. She was going to find that answer, and she was going to do it with everything she had. The future wasn't something that happened to her. The future was something she could create. And as Margaret closed her laptop, the weight she had carried for so many years seemed just a little bit lighter. The next few weeks felt like a whirlwind of new possibilities for Margaret. She dove headfirst into learning everything she could about Neuralink, brain-computer interfaces, and the potential for technology to revolutionize healthcare. She signed up for online courses, watched documentaries, and spent hours reading research papers. While her mind had always been sharp, she hadn't had to absorb this kind of technical information in years, and at times, it felt overwhelming. But there was something invigorating about it, something that made her feel alive again. Each new discovery brought a sense of excitement, as if the world were opening up to her in ways she had never imagined. And when the doubts crept in, and they did, often, she remembered that quote from Elon Musk, "The future belongs to those who can look at problems and say, I'm going to solve that." She wasn't in this alone, and the more she connected with people online, the more she realized how many others, just like her, were determined to make a difference. She couldn't count the number of times she had posted a question or shared a thought on the forums, only to receive responses from individuals who had spent decades in the field of medicine, technology, or neuroscience, all of them excited to help her. One evening, as she was preparing dinner, her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but Margaret had learned not to be so quick to dismiss calls anymore. She had gotten a lot of feedback on her posts about Neuralink in the healthcare industry, and maybe it was another person with advice or questions. She picked up. "Hello, is this Margaret?" a voice on the other end asked. It was a woman's voice, warm and clear. "Yes, this is Margaret." "Who is this?" she replied, her curiosity piqued. "My name's Sarah. I've been following your posts on the Neuralink forums, and I think you're onto something big," Sarah said. "I work for a nonprofit that's focused on innovation in senior healthcare, and we're actually partnering with some folks in the tech sector to look at ways that advanced technology, like Neuralink, can benefit older adults. I'd love to talk to you about it." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Was this really happening? "I'd be honored to talk," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've been trying to wrap my mind around all of this, and the more I learn, the more excited I get." "That's exactly why I'm calling," Sarah replied. "We're trying to bring together a network of people like you, people who aren't just thinking about how technology can improve healthcare, but how it can specifically improve the lives of older adults. And from what I can tell, you have a lot of experience and knowledge that could be invaluable to our work." Margaret's heart swelled with pride. She had spent years in the healthcare industry, but it had been so long since she had felt like her experience mattered. It was like the door to something bigger had just opened. "I'd love to be involved," Margaret said, her voice full of purpose. "I've spent so much time focusing on how aging affects our physical health, but there's a mental and neurological aspect to it too. And that's where I see the potential for technology, like Neuralink, to make a real impact. I want to be part of that conversation." "I couldn't agree more," Sarah said. "We're still in the early stages of this project, but we're really looking for people with practical knowledge, people who have worked in the healthcare field, who know the challenges that older adults face every day. You're exactly the kind of person we need." After that conversation, Margaret felt a renewed sense of purpose. She hadn't realized how isolated she had become over the years, especially as she dealt with her own personal losses and limitations. But now, she was part of something bigger, something that could make a real impact. In the days that followed, Margaret attended several online meetings with Sarah and her team. They were focused on creating a research initiative that would explore the ways in which brain-computer interfaces could help seniors maintain cognitive function, fight off neurological diseases like Alzheimer's, and even improve quality of life in ways that hadn't been possible before. Margaret's role was to bring her medical expertise to the table, to help guide the team on the ground-level challenges that older adults faced when it came to healthcare. She had the experience to know what worked, and what didn't, and she could see how this new technology could bridge the gap between the current healthcare system and the future. One evening, after a particularly engaging virtual meeting, Margaret sat in her favorite chair by the window, sipping tea and reflecting on how far she had come. A year ago, she had been staring at that photograph of her younger self, wondering if it was too late to change. Now, she was talking to some of the brightest minds in the healthcare and tech industries, all of them committed to creating a future where aging wasn't a burden, but an opportunity. As she sat there, the thought occurred to her that perhaps she wasn't just part of the project because of her expertise. Maybe she was also there because her story had resonated with Sarah and the others. She had lived through the challenges of aging, and she understood the unique needs of older adults. But there was more to it than that. She realized that she wasn't just a passive participant in this conversation, she was a catalyst. Her story, her experience, was a powerful reminder that it wasn't too late to change, to adapt, and to find new purpose. She could be an example of what was possible, even in the later stages of life. Margaret stood up from her chair and walked over to the small desk in the corner of the room. She opened her laptop and began drafting an article for the project's website. It was a reflection on her own journey, how she had gone from feeling forgotten and irrelevant to being part of something groundbreaking. She wrote about the role technology could play in transforming the way society viewed aging, and how it could open up new doors for older adults to continue contributing to the world. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she poured her thoughts into the document. When she finished, she sat back and reread the article. It was raw, personal, and full of hope. It wasn't just about Neuralink. It was about the power of reinvention, the power of refusing to accept that age had to be a limitation. The future belongs to those who create it. Margaret smiled, knowing that she had finally found her place in it. She hit send, feeling a sense of accomplishment wash over her. The next morning, Sarah called again. "Margaret, that article you wrote, wow. It's exactly what we needed. I've shared it with the team, and we all agree that your voice is something we can't afford to ignore. We'd like to feature it as part of our upcoming campaign to raise awareness about how technology like Neuralink can help older adults. Would you be willing to help us with the outreach?" Margaret's heart swelled with pride. "Absolutely," she said, feeling the fire of purpose burn even brighter. "I'll do whatever it takes to get this message out there." Over the next few months, Margaret worked tirelessly with Sarah and the team. She became a spokesperson for the initiative, sharing her story at conferences, writing articles, and participating in discussions about how technology could improve the lives of older adults. Her voice, once so quiet and hesitant, was now loud and clear, advocating for the change she had longed to see. She had found her new calling, one that didn't have an expiration date. The more she worked, the more she realized that the message wasn't just for others. It was for herself, too. The future wasn't just something that happened to her. It was something she was actively shaping, and she was doing it with purpose, with passion, and with a sense of power she hadn't known she still possessed. As the years passed, Margaret became a symbol of transformation, a living testament to the fact that it's never too late to change. She had embraced technology, embraced new ideas, and embraced the fact that age was not the enemy, it was just another stage in the journey. And she was determined to make it count. As the months turned into a year, Margaret found herself at the forefront of a movement that was reshaping the way society viewed aging. She had gone from a quiet retiree, quietly mourning the loss of her former self, to a passionate advocate for technological innovation in healthcare. Every step of her journey had been fueled by a burning desire to prove that age was not a barrier to change, that it wasn't too late to make an impact. Her work with Sarah and the nonprofit had grown steadily, and their initiative to explore how technology could transform the lives of older adults had begun to gain traction. More and more seniors were reaching out, sharing their stories of how neurological diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's had stolen their independence, their memories, and their sense of self. Margaret listened to each story with empathy, knowing that these people weren't just statistics. They were human beings with rich, complicated lives, each of them yearning for something more. It was during one of the outreach meetings that Margaret met Jennifer, a woman in her late 70s who had recently been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's. Jennifer had been a teacher for decades, shaping the minds of countless students. But now, she was losing the one thing she had always cherished most, her ability to remember. As Margaret sat down with Jennifer during a small group discussion, she was struck by the raw vulnerability in Jennifer's eyes. "I'm scared," Jennifer confessed, her voice shaking. "I've spent my entire life helping others, but now I feel like I'm slipping away. I don't know how much longer I'll be able to remember my husband's face, my children's names, the people who meant the most to me. And worse, I don't know if I'll ever be able to help anyone again." Margaret reached out and placed a comforting hand on Jennifer's. "Jennifer, I understand how you feel. But you're not alone. And you're not out of time. We're working on solutions that could change everything. Technologies like Neuralink could make a difference, not just in the way we treat diseases, but in the way we view aging itself. You're part of a bigger picture now, and your story, your voice, is crucial to this change." Jennifer looked at her, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Do you really think so?" Margaret smiled gently. "I know so. You've spent a lifetime helping others, and you still have so much to offer. The future isn't about letting go of who we were, it's about embracing who we can become." Jennifer nodded, her face softening as she absorbed Margaret's words. Margaret knew that the road ahead would be long, but this conversation, this connection, reminded her why she had chosen to step out of the shadows of retirement and into the light of advocacy. Together with Sarah's team, Margaret had helped launch a pilot program focused on integrating brain-computer interfaces into the treatment of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. While it was still in its early stages, the results were promising. They were testing whether these interfaces could not only slow the progression of cognitive decline but also enhance memory retention, increase cognitive function, and give patients more control over their own lives. Margaret felt a sense of pride each time she saw the smiles of those involved in the study. These were people who had been written off by society, people who had been told that they were too old to make a difference, too far gone to benefit from the advancements of modern science. But here they were, fighting back against the narrative that aging meant inevitable decline. Every success, no matter how small, was a victory. But there were days when Margaret still wrestled with doubts. Even as she stood in front of an audience, advocating for the potential of technology to change lives, she couldn't help but wonder if her own life was running out of time. What if this work was her last great contribution, her final act of reinvention? What if, after all of this, there was nothing left? It was during one of these moments of self-doubt that Margaret received a call that would change everything. It was a Sunday afternoon when her phone rang. She had been preparing lunch when she saw the number on the screen. It was Sarah. Margaret quickly answered. "Margaret, we've been working on something huge," Sarah's voice was full of excitement. "We've just been invited to present our findings at the annual Healthcare Innovation Summit. The organizers want to hear about how Neuralink and other technologies can revolutionize the treatment of neurological diseases in older adults. It's a huge opportunity." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "That's incredible. Are we ready?" she asked, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. "We are. But here's the thing, this could be your moment, Margaret," Sarah said. "We want you to be the one to present. Your story, your voice, what you've experienced, what you're advocating for. It's powerful. People need to hear it." Margaret's hands trembled as she put the phone down. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. It wasn't just about technology. It was about her. It was about showing the world that people like her, people who had spent their lives helping others, still had something to offer. Margaret spent the next few weeks preparing for the summit. She refined her speech, practicing it over and over again, until the words felt like a part of her. She wasn't just talking about the potential of Neuralink or the future of healthcare, she was talking about herself, about every person who had ever been told they were too old, too tired, too irrelevant to matter. She was speaking for those who had been forgotten by society. When the day of the summit arrived, Margaret stood backstage, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. It wasn't just a presentation. It was her chance to change the way people viewed aging, to change the narrative. As the lights dimmed and the audience quieted, Margaret took a deep breath and stepped out onto the stage. The applause that followed was unexpected, but deeply moving. As she approached the podium, she could see the sea of faces in front of her. There were doctors, scientists, entrepreneurs, and innovators from all over the world, all gathered to discuss the future of healthcare. But Margaret wasn't just one of many. She was the one they were all waiting to hear from. "Thank you," Margaret began, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I stand before you today not as a scientist, not as a researcher, but as a human being. I am someone who has lived through the challenges of aging. I know what it feels like to be told that your best years are behind you, that the world has no more use for you. I know what it feels like to be invisible. But I also know that this is a lie. The truth is, it's never too late. It's never too late to learn, to grow, to contribute. And it's never too late to fight for a future where aging is not something to fear, but something to embrace." The room was silent, all eyes on her. Margaret continued, her words flowing with conviction. "I've spent years in the healthcare field, watching as people like me, people who are older, are treated like they've somehow passed their expiration date. But the truth is, we are more than our age. We are more than our diseases. And with technologies like Neuralink, we have the power to rewrite the future. We have the power to give people back their memories, their cognitive function, their lives. And we have the power to help people like me, who are looking for a second chance, to find meaning, purpose, and fulfillment." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the room. "I'm here today because I believe that technology can help us rediscover who we are, no matter how old we are. I'm here today because I believe that we all deserve a chance to live our lives fully, to contribute, and to matter." Margaret's eyes scanned the room, meeting the gaze of people who had once looked at her with skepticism. But now, there was respect in their eyes. She had proven something, not just to them, but to herself. The future wasn't something that happened to her, it was something she could create. As the applause erupted in the room, Margaret smiled, feeling the weight of the years that had passed behind her, knowing that she had finally found her place in the world. And in that moment, she realized that this wasn't just the beginning of a new chapter. It was the beginning of a legacy. In the months following the Healthcare Innovation Summit, Margaret's life took on an unexpected momentum. The presentation she had given had reverberated through the halls of the summit, sparking conversations that continued well after the event had concluded. Doctors, technologists, and entrepreneurs who had once seen aging as a passive process now began to ask themselves, what if it could be different? Margaret's story had shifted something deep inside them, challenging their assumptions about aging and the potential for breakthroughs in treating neurological diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. For Margaret, the shift wasn't just in the world around her, it was internal, too. Standing in front of an audience had been a test of everything she had worked through, the self-doubt, the fear, the quiet resignation that had once taken root inside her. But now, when she looked at her reflection in the mirror, she didn't see the woman who had once feared that her best years were behind her. Instead, she saw a woman who was actively shaping the future. She felt lighter, freer, more present than she had in years. But there was still so much work to be done. Margaret knew that Neuralink and other similar technologies weren't magic cures. They wouldn't change everything overnight. But she also knew that they were part of a larger shift, a paradigm change in how society viewed aging and, more importantly, how it treated its older citizens. She wanted to be part of that movement, to be more than just an advocate for technology. She wanted to help rewrite the narrative for people like Jennifer and the thousands of others who had come to her seeking hope. It was on one of these quiet afternoons, as Margaret sat at her kitchen table sorting through her emails, that she received an invitation from a new partner, one that would take her mission to the next level. The email was from Dr. Andrew Hill, a leading neuroscientist working in the field of neuroplasticity and cognitive rehabilitation. He had seen Margaret's presentation and was eager to collaborate. "Dear Margaret," the email began, "I was deeply moved by your talk at the summit. Your perspective on the intersection of aging and innovation aligns with the work we are doing at the Neuroplasticity Institute. We're looking for advocates who can help bridge the gap between scientific research and the lived experiences of seniors who are impacted by neurological diseases. I believe you can be a powerful voice in helping us create a future where cognitive decline is not a given. Let's discuss how we can collaborate to make this vision a reality." Margaret read the email twice, her heart pounding with excitement. This was the kind of opportunity she had dreamed of. The chance to be part of a team of innovators working on something that could fundamentally alter the way the world cared for its aging population. She immediately responded, eager to set up a meeting. When she met Dr. Hill in person a few weeks later, it was clear that their visions were aligned. Dr. Hill was a man in his late 40s, sharp-eyed and driven. He spoke with a kind of urgency that matched Margaret's own, a sense that time was precious, that there was no time to waste in making the world a better place for older adults. "Margaret," he said as they sat down for coffee, "your work at the summit has opened up a new conversation in healthcare. But we can't stop there. The science is advancing, but it's the people, like you, who will make this a reality for the broader population. What we need is a true partnership between researchers, healthcare providers, and patients. We need someone who can advocate for the patient's voice, the human element of this research." Margaret felt a surge of purpose. She wasn't just a passive recipient of this work, she was becoming a key player in it. Together, she and Dr. Hill crafted a series of initiatives designed to incorporate the experiences of older adults into the ongoing research about brain-computer interfaces, cognitive rehabilitation, and neuroplasticity. They knew that without the input from those who were directly affected by neurological diseases, their work would miss the mark. Margaret became the bridge, someone who could help translate the complex scientific research into real-world applications. As they moved forward, they began organizing focus groups of older adults who had been diagnosed with neurological conditions. These groups became a place not only for research but for emotional connection. Margaret could see it every time she spoke with someone who had recently been diagnosed. They were no longer speaking to her from a place of resignation or fear. There was hope in their eyes, a belief that something could be done, that they didn't have to simply accept their diagnosis as an inevitable decline. There was one conversation in particular that stayed with Margaret long after it had ended. It was with a man named Henry, a retired engineer in his early 70s who had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. Henry had been a problem solver his whole life, someone who saw challenges as opportunities. But Alzheimer's was different. "I've spent my life fixing things, Margaret," Henry had told her. "But this feels like something I can't fix. I can't even remember if I took my medication this morning. I can't trust my own mind anymore. It's terrifying." Margaret had listened carefully, her heart heavy with empathy. She had seen so many people like Henry, brilliant, capable individuals who were being robbed of the very thing that had defined them, their minds. But she also saw something else, something that had been ignited in him when he spoke about technology. What if he could fix this? What if he could be part of the solution? "Henry," Margaret said gently, "you're not alone in this. And it's not too late. There are solutions out there. I believe that with the right technology, we can slow down this process, even reverse some of it. But it's not just about the tech. It's about us, working together, sharing our stories, and demanding that things change. You don't have to face this alone." Henry had looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and resolve. "I want to be part of that solution, Margaret. I want to make a difference. I don't want to just fade away." Margaret had smiled, her heart swelling with pride. This was why she was doing this work, not just for herself, but for people like Henry. And for every person who had been told they were too old, too ill, too far gone to make a difference. Margaret and Dr. Hill began to create a network of advocates, seniors, caregivers, and healthcare professionals, who would work together to push for the integration of brain-computer interfaces into mainstream treatment options for neurological diseases. They reached out to hospitals, research institutions, and government officials, sharing their findings and pushing for policy changes. It was slow work. Change, they knew, was never easy. But each step forward felt like a victory. And each victory brought them closer to a world where aging wasn't something to fear, but something to embrace. One evening, as Margaret sat in her office, drafting a letter to a prominent medical journal, she took a moment to reflect. She thought about her own journey, the years of silence, the years of feeling invisible. She thought about how far she had come since she first read that quote from Elon Musk, "The future belongs to those who create it." She had created a future for herself, a future that was full of purpose, hope, and possibility. And she had helped create a future for others, too. She wasn't just an advocate for technology. She was a trailblazer in a movement that was changing the way the world cared for its aging population. And she was proud of it. As the evening sky outside her window turned to dusk, Margaret realized that the work was far from over. There was still so much to be done. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She had found her place in the world, and the world was listening. The following months proved to be some of the most rewarding yet challenging of Margaret's life. The advocacy work she had started was gaining momentum, but so were the hurdles that came with pushing for such radical change. The medical and technological worlds, for all their advancements, were often slow to accept new ideas, especially ideas that challenged long-held beliefs about aging, cognitive decline, and healthcare practices. Margaret understood this more than anyone. She knew the importance of persistence in the face of skepticism. But she also knew that her work, and the work of others like her, was not just about proving a point, it was about saving lives. As she sat at her desk late one evening, reviewing data from the most recent pilot program of Neuralink's applications for cognitive rehabilitation, her thoughts drifted to the people who had shared their stories with her. The patients, the caregivers, and the families. She thought about Henry, and Jennifer, and all the other people who had reached out to her, telling her that for the first time in years, they had a sense of hope. Hope. It had become a powerful word for Margaret, one that she carried like a shield as she entered each new meeting, every new conversation. But hope was not enough on its own. Change required action, persistence, and a willingness to challenge entrenched systems of care. And in many ways, Margaret was now facing the hardest challenge yet, convincing healthcare providers to take the leap with this new technology. Neuralink, for all its promise, was still a controversial topic in many medical circles. Critics argued that it was too untested, too futuristic. Some even feared it was unethical to implant technology into the human brain, even if the potential benefits were groundbreaking. Margaret couldn't ignore the criticisms, but she refused to let them derail the progress she had made. She wasn't asking for blind trust, she was asking for a willingness to explore, to see the possibilities and take calculated risks. She believed in the technology, but more importantly, she believed in the people who could benefit from it. The turning point came when Margaret received an unexpected invitation to a major medical conference in Washington, D.C. The organizers had read her work and listened to her speech at the summit, and they wanted her to present the real-world applications of Neuralink and other brain-computer interfaces in treating cognitive decline in older adults. This wasn't just a small conference, this was an event that brought together the most influential minds in healthcare policy, research, and innovation. It was a chance to shape the direction of the field. Margaret knew that this was the opportunity she had been waiting for. But there was one catch: the keynote speaker at the conference was none other than Dr. Richard Davis, a well-respected neurologist who had been outspoken in his opposition to brain-computer interfaces for the treatment of cognitive decline. Dr. Davis had published papers decrying the ethics and practicality of implanting technology into the human brain, and he was known for his skepticism about anything that hadn't been thoroughly tested over decades of research. The thought of presenting alongside Dr. Davis made Margaret uneasy. She knew that his reputation carried weight in the medical community, and the last thing she wanted was to find herself in a public debate with him about the dangers of innovation. But Margaret was not one to back down from a challenge. She spent the following weeks meticulously preparing for her presentation, determined to present the facts, the data, and the human stories that would resonate with even the most skeptical audience. She wasn't going to let Dr. Davis's opposition, or anyone else's, stop her from doing what she knew was right. The day of the conference arrived, and as Margaret stood backstage, waiting for her turn to present, she couldn't help but feel a surge of nervous energy. She glanced around at the sea of faces in the audience, doctors, researchers, and policymakers who held the power to influence the future of healthcare. This was the moment she had worked for, the moment that would decide whether or not her vision would be taken seriously. Dr. Davis was already at the podium, speaking about the risks and ethical considerations surrounding brain-computer interfaces. He was well-spoken, authoritative, and clearly had the room's attention. Margaret took a deep breath and reminded herself why she was there. She wasn't just a researcher or a technologist, she was a voice for the people who had been forgotten, the people whose lives could be radically changed if the world would only listen. When her turn came, she stepped onto the stage with a quiet confidence, ready to face the challenge head-on. "Good morning," she began, her voice calm and steady. "I'm Margaret Sullivan, and I'm here today to share with you the stories of people who have been told that they are too old to change. People who have been written off by society because of the very thing that makes them human, aging. But I'm also here to tell you that aging doesn't have to be a process of inevitable decline. Not anymore. We have the power to rewrite the narrative. And technologies like Neuralink are at the forefront of this revolution." Margaret paused and scanned the room, feeling the weight of her words. She continued, "In the work we've done over the past year, we've seen firsthand how brain-computer interfaces can give people their lives back, allowing them to regain memories, cognitive function, and independence that they had lost. We've seen people like Henry, a retired engineer in his 70s who thought he was losing everything to Alzheimer's, regain his sense of self. We've seen Jennifer, a former teacher in her 60s, begin to reconnect with her students through a new program that enhances cognitive function. These are real stories. These are real lives being changed by the very technology that some of you might still be questioning." Margaret's words were met with a mix of curiosity and skepticism from the audience, but she didn't falter. She continued, "Now, I understand that there are valid concerns surrounding the ethics of implanting technology into the brain. These concerns are not something we should ignore. But we must also ask ourselves, if we have the opportunity to give someone back their memories, their independence, their ability to live a full life, shouldn't we at least explore that possibility? Isn't it our responsibility to challenge the limitations that have been placed on us by outdated thinking?" Margaret's eyes then turned toward Dr. Davis, who had been listening intently from his seat. She knew this wasn't just a scientific debate, it was a cultural one. It was about whether society was ready to accept that aging didn't have to be a death sentence for the mind. "We are living in an age of incredible technological advancement," Margaret continued. "And it is time we start applying those advancements to the challenges of aging. The reality is that many of us are going to grow old, and we deserve the opportunity to live our lives fully, whether we're 70, 80, or 90 years old. Technologies like Neuralink are not about replacing the human brain, they're about enhancing it. And they are our best hope for preventing the cognitive decline that robs us of who we are." As Margaret spoke, she could see the shift in the room. There was no immediate applause, but there was a shift in the energy, a recognition that perhaps there was a new way forward. When her presentation ended, Dr. Davis was the first to speak. He stood and, to Margaret's surprise, nodded thoughtfully. "I have to admit," he said, his voice steady but filled with respect, "I've always been a skeptic. But what you've presented here today is compelling. I think we need to reconsider our stance on these technologies. Not for the sake of the technology itself, but for the sake of the people who could benefit from it." The room was quiet for a moment, and then, slowly, the applause began. It wasn't a loud ovation, but it was enough, a sign that Margaret had made her case. She had done it. The applause was not thunderous, but it was there, soft and respectful, and for Margaret, it felt like a quiet victory. As the audience slowly filed out of the room after her presentation, she stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the moment settle in. It wasn't just that she had made her case about the technology. She had also convinced these leaders, these experts, to reconsider what they thought they knew about aging, about the limits of the human brain, about who deserved a second chance. But in the back of her mind, Margaret knew that this was just one step of many. The real work, the work that would ultimately change lives, would come in the months and years ahead. The meeting with Dr. Davis had been unexpected, but it had planted a seed in both their minds. He approached Margaret after the session, his hand extended. "Margaret, I must admit, you've given me a lot to think about," he said, his voice no longer laced with the skepticism it had held earlier. "I'd like to continue this conversation. Perhaps we could look into a joint research initiative. We could investigate the long-term effects of brain-computer interfaces on older adults, especially in terms of cognitive restoration." Margaret shook his hand, her heart swelling with the rare sense of triumph that only came after a long fight. "I'd be honored," she replied. "It's time we do something about it, don't you think?" Over the next few months, Margaret and Dr. Davis, along with a team of scientists, healthcare providers, and patient advocates, began to work on a groundbreaking study that would be one of the largest of its kind. They sought to measure the effects of Neuralink implants on cognitive decline, focusing on seniors with early-stage Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. The goal wasn't just to demonstrate that the technology could slow or halt cognitive decline, but that it could offer a new path for recovery. An opportunity for those affected to regain lost memories, cognitive function, and even independence. The study's design was ambitious, and the challenges were monumental. Margaret often found herself in meetings where it seemed like every obstacle imaginable was being thrown in their way. Institutional inertia, funding issues, and legal concerns all had to be addressed. But through it all, Margaret remained the steady force that held everything together. Every time she encountered resistance, she thought back to the faces of the people she had met, Henry, Jennifer, the countless others who had placed their trust in her and the technology. They were her constant reminder that failure was not an option. As the study progressed, Margaret continued her work as an advocate, pushing for policy changes that would allow broader access to these life-changing technologies. She traveled the country, meeting with lawmakers, healthcare leaders, and organizations dedicated to improving the lives of older adults. In every conversation, she was unwavering in her belief that technology could and should be used to enhance the lives of seniors, not just to manage the inevitable decline that many were told to accept. One of the most pivotal moments came during a meeting with the Health and Human Services Committee in Washington, D.C. Margaret had been invited to present on the role of technology in improving the quality of life for older Americans, and the stakes were high. The committee had been slow to adopt new healthcare policies, particularly when it came to innovations like brain-computer interfaces, and Margaret knew this meeting could be the turning point. She walked into the conference room with a sense of purpose. The committee members were seated around a long table, some familiar with her work, others only vaguely aware of her efforts. Margaret had prepared her presentation carefully, knowing that she would need more than just facts to persuade them. She needed to speak from the heart. "We often think of aging as a period of decline," she began, her voice steady and commanding. "But what if we changed that narrative? What if, instead of assuming that cognitive decline is inevitable, we accepted that it doesn't have to be the end of the story? What if we told our elders that they still matter, that their memories, their minds, their potential still have value?" She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. The technology we're discussing today, Neuralink and similar advancements, are not about playing God or altering the essence of who we are. They're about restoring what has been lost. They're about giving people the opportunity to live their lives fully, regardless of their age or diagnosis. Margaret knew that the committee's members were skeptical, that they would need proof. But she also knew that the proof was in the stories of people like Henry, who had once thought his life was over, only to discover that his mind still had so much to give. Imagine, she continued, a world where aging doesn't mean fading into obscurity. A world where the older population is given the tools to continue contributing, to continue creating, to continue living with dignity and purpose. That world is within our reach, but it will require bold action. It will require us to challenge the status quo. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then, one of the committee members, a woman in her late 50s, spoke. "This sounds like something out of science fiction," she said, her tone skeptical. "How can we be sure this is safe? How can we be sure that the benefits outweigh the risks?" Margaret met her gaze. "I understand your concerns. And they're valid. But we can no longer afford to wait for the perfect solution. We have to start somewhere. The risks of doing nothing are far greater than the risks of exploring this technology responsibly." Another committee member, a man in his 70s, leaned forward. "But what about the ethics of implanting technology into the human brain? What about the potential for exploitation? We can't simply rush into this without considering the long-term consequences." Margaret nodded, understanding the gravity of his concerns. "I agree. But we also need to consider the ethical implications of not offering these options to people who are suffering. The ethical dilemma we face is not whether to pursue this technology, but how we can do so responsibly and with the best interests of our elders at heart." After a tense silence, another committee member spoke up. "I think it's time we have a real conversation about this. Margaret, you've given us a lot to think about. We'll need more data, more studies, but I'm willing to open the door to further discussion. We can't ignore the potential here." Margaret's heart lifted. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. She had done it. The conversation had shifted. By the time she left the meeting, Margaret knew that things were starting to change. Slowly but surely, the world was beginning to realize that age was not a barrier to transformation. And she, along with Dr. Davis and countless others, would continue to push for a future where aging wasn't a time of decline, but a time of renewal. Margaret's work was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, she felt an overwhelming sense of possibility. The future, as Elon Musk had said, belonged to those who created it. And Margaret was ready to create. As the months passed, Margaret's life became a whirlwind of meetings, research papers, policy discussions, and presentations. The study with Dr. Davis was progressing, but the road was long and filled with obstacles. The medical world, as much as it was advancing, still clung to conservative views about the limitations of technology and its application to aging. Despite the progress Margaret had made in the past year, she knew this fight wasn't going to be won easily. But there was something that had shifted inside her, something that couldn't be undone. The moment she had stood on that stage in Washington, D.C., and spoken her truth, she had tapped into a force that pushed her forward even when the challenges seemed insurmountable. The doors she had once knocked on had begun to open just a little wider. And each time she stepped through one, she found herself a step closer to the future she had always dreamed of, a future where aging was not something to fear, but something to embrace. One evening, as Margaret sat at her desk reviewing a new study on the efficacy of Neuralink in reversing the effects of cognitive decline, her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code told her it was from California. She answered quickly, her curiosity piqued. "Hello, this is Margaret Sullivan," she said, trying to mask the fatigue in her voice. "Margaret, this is Ryan Williams, calling from Neuralink," the voice on the other end said. Margaret straightened in her chair, her mind racing. "Neuralink? Why are they calling me? We've been following your work closely, and we've been impressed by your advocacy efforts. The study you're doing with Dr. Davis is groundbreaking, and we believe we can help take it to the next level." Ryan paused for a moment, and Margaret could hear the excitement in his voice. "We're exploring new avenues for expanding the impact of Neuralink, particularly in the realm of aging and cognitive health. And we'd like to offer you an opportunity to be a part of our next phase of research. Would you be open to discussing it?" Margaret's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment she had been waiting for, an invitation from the very company whose technology she had been championing. She wasn't sure what this opportunity entailed, but she knew it could be a game changer. "Of course," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'd love to hear more about it." Over the next week, Ryan and his team shared their vision with Margaret. They were planning to launch an ambitious new initiative that would bring together scientists, healthcare providers, and patient advocates to create a comprehensive, scalable solution for cognitive rehabilitation using Neuralink's brain-computer interface. The goal wasn't just to treat cognitive decline, it was to restore functionality and cognitive ability to the point where patients could regain a significant level of independence. The project, which they had dubbed Cognition Reborn, would be an all-encompassing approach that combined cutting-edge technology, physical therapy, cognitive exercises, and personalized care plans. But the project needed someone who could bridge the gap between science and the lived experiences of older adults, someone who understood the emotional and social aspects of aging as well as the technological possibilities. Ryan and his team believed Margaret was the perfect fit. "We think you're the key to making this work," Ryan told her. "We need someone who can advocate for the patients, who understands their needs and their fears. Someone who can help us make sure that this technology isn't just about science, it's about people." Margaret didn't hesitate. She agreed to join the initiative, thrilled by the opportunity to take her advocacy to a whole new level. Over the next few months, she worked closely with Neuralink's engineers, neuroscientists, and healthcare experts, helping to design and implement the Cognition Reborn program. The research would be conducted across several clinical sites, and the data would be used to refine the technology and make it accessible to a wider audience. The work was intense, but Margaret loved every minute of it. She felt like she was finally part of something truly transformative. One of the most rewarding aspects of the project was the opportunity to work directly with patients. Every day, Margaret met with older adults who were struggling with memory loss, confusion, and other cognitive impairments. It was humbling to hear their stories, to witness their courage as they faced the unknown, and to see the spark of hope in their eyes when they learned about the potential of the technology. There was one patient in particular who stood out to Margaret. Clara, a retired librarian in her late 60s who had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's. Clara had always been an avid reader, her mind sharp and curious. But over the past few years, her memory had begun to deteriorate, and she found herself losing the ability to enjoy the things she once loved. "I used to read 3 books a week," Clara told Margaret one afternoon as they sat together in a quiet corner of the clinic. "But now I forget the names of the characters. I forget the plot. It's like I'm losing pieces of myself, one by one." Margaret could hear the sadness in Clara's voice, the grief of someone who had seen her identity slip away. But there was something else in Clara's eyes, something that Margaret had seen in others like her, a flicker of determination, a refusal to give up. "Clara," Margaret said gently, "I know it feels like you're losing yourself. But I believe there's still so much of you to be found. This technology, it's not a cure. But it's an opportunity to reconnect with your mind, to restore parts of yourself that you thought were gone." Clara nodded slowly, as if processing the idea. "I don't know if it will work," she said, her voice quiet. "But I'm willing to try. I've spent my life reading, learning, teaching. If I can still do that, even a little, I'll be grateful." Margaret smiled, feeling a deep sense of empathy for Clara. It was moments like these that reminded her why she was doing this work, to help people like Clara rediscover themselves, to give them back a piece of their identity. The Cognition Reborn program began to yield promising results. Patients who had undergone the Neuralink procedure and participated in the cognitive rehabilitation program showed significant improvements in memory recall, problem-solving skills, and emotional regulation. Of course, the improvements varied from patient to patient, and there were still challenges to overcome. But for Margaret, the progress was undeniable. Clara was one of the success stories. After just a few months of using the brain-computer interface, Clara began to experience a marked improvement in her cognitive function. She started reading again, not with the same ease as before, but with a newfound sense of accomplishment. "I can remember the characters now," Clara told Margaret one day, her voice filled with wonder. "Not all of them, but enough to enjoy the story. And I can feel the spark inside me again, the spark I thought was gone." As Clara's condition improved, so did the sense of optimism that Margaret had carried with her throughout the project. It was working. The technology wasn't perfect, but it was making a real difference in people's lives. And Margaret knew that this was just the beginning. There was still so much more to do, so many lives to touch, so much more to prove. But in that moment, as she watched Clara read a book that had once felt beyond her reach, Margaret felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She wasn't just fighting for a new technology, she was fighting for the right of older adults to live their lives with dignity, with purpose, and with the full use of their minds. This was the future she had envisioned, a future where age wasn't a barrier to transformation, but a pathway to it. And for the first time in her life, Margaret believed with everything she had that it was a future within reach. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The success of Cognition Reborn was a watershed moment, but Margaret knew it was only one piece of the puzzle. As the program gained traction and more patients reported improvements, the question of scalability loomed large. Neuralink's technology was promising, but it was still expensive, and the number of qualified practitioners capable of implementing it was limited. Margaret found herself at a crossroads. How could she ensure that the benefits of this groundbreaking technology reached the millions of older adults across the country who needed it most? The challenge wasn't just about technology, it was about access. It was about breaking down the barriers that existed not just in medical practices but in healthcare policy, insurance, and societal attitudes about aging. As Margaret dove deeper into the logistics of scaling the Cognition Reborn program, she realized that one of the most critical obstacles was the entrenched perception of aging as a process of inevitable decline. The prevailing attitude was that getting older meant accepting cognitive loss, physical decline, and a diminishing quality of life. Even with the successes of the program, this cultural mindset was difficult to change. Margaret spent more time in meetings with insurance companies and policymakers, advocating for the inclusion of cutting-edge cognitive restoration technologies in healthcare plans for older adults. It wasn't easy. The insurance industry, as she had learned early on, was notoriously slow to adopt new treatments, especially ones that were as unfamiliar and experimental as brain-computer interfaces. Every conversation felt like a battle, but Margaret was unwavering. She knew that if she could convince the insurance companies that the technology was worth the investment, not just for the individuals it helped, but for society as a whole, then the floodgates might finally open. One particular meeting stood out. It was with the head of a major insurance provider, a man named Robert Ellis, who had built his career on finding ways to reduce healthcare costs. Robert was a numbers guy, a pragmatic realist. He wasn't easily swayed by emotional appeals or feel-good stories, he needed data. So Margaret came prepared. "Mr. Ellis," she began, "I know you're here to talk about the bottom line. And I understand that cost is always a consideration. But let me show you something that could change the way we approach aging and cognitive decline." She projected a series of charts onto the screen, data from the Cognition Reborn program, showing how cognitive restoration through Neuralink had led to a reduction in healthcare costs over time. Patients who had undergone the treatment required fewer hospital visits, fewer medications, and less long-term care. They were living independently for longer and were less likely to develop severe comorbidities. This isn't just about technology. It's about cost savings in the long term, Margaret continued. By investing in these treatments now, you can reduce the burden of age-related cognitive decline later. We're talking about fewer hospital admissions, fewer nursing home placements, fewer strokes, and less dementia. The financial benefits will far outweigh the initial investment. Robert studied the numbers on the screen, his brow furrowed in thought. After a long silence, he spoke. "I've seen the data. It's impressive, to to say the least. But there's still the question of trust. This technology is new, and proven in the long term. How can we be sure that it's not just a flash in the pan? Margaret took a deep breath. She had anticipated this question, and she was ready for it. That's why we're building the evidence now, she said. The Cognition Reborn program is just the beginning. We have a long-term study underway with Dr. Davis that will track the effects of Neuralink for years. It's not just a one-off solution, it's a scalable model for the future. And when people's lives improve, when they're able to live independently, when they can work, engage, and contribute. They're not just saving money, they're saving their own dignity. The room fell silent again. Robert leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping thoughtfully on the desk. Margaret felt a mix of anticipation and apprehension. She had made her case, but would it be enough? After what felt like an eternity, Robert spoke again. "You're right about one thing, Margaret," he said slowly. "This isn't just about the numbers. It's about people. And I can see the potential in what you're proposing. But we'll need more than just data. We'll need to see real-world applications, to understand how this technology can be integrated into our existing systems. If we're going to take a leap of faith, we'll need to be sure that the technology is safe and sustainable." Margaret nodded, a sense of relief flooding over her. "I understand," she said. "And we're working on that. We have a comprehensive roadmap for scaling this technology, and we're committed to ensuring that it's safe and effective at every stage. But the first step is getting the ball rolling." Robert stood up, offering his hand. "Let's take the first step then, Margaret. We'll start by covering the costs for a pilot program. Let's see where this goes." Margaret shook his hand, her heart racing. This was the breakthrough she had been hoping for. With the insurance company's support, she could begin the process of expanding Cognition Reborn to a much larger population. But even as she celebrated this victory, Margaret knew that the real challenge was just beginning. Scaling a program like this would take time, resources, and unwavering commitment. She would need to work with state and federal agencies, healthcare providers, and advocacy organizations to ensure that the program could be implemented nationwide. And she knew she couldn't do it alone. She reached out to her colleagues in the aging and technology fields, asking for their help in lobbying for policy changes that would create the infrastructure necessary for this technology to reach as many people as possible. Together, they launched a national campaign to bring attention to the benefits of cognitive rehabilitation through brain-computer interfaces. The campaign focused on the economic, emotional, and social benefits of the technology, emphasizing that older adults could remain vital contributors to society, rather than being sidelined by age-related decline. The response was overwhelming. People from all over the country reached out to share their stories, offering their support for the campaign. Margaret was flooded with messages from families who had witnessed the decline of loved ones and from seniors who wanted to learn more about the technology. In response to the growing demand, Margaret helped establish a new partnership with a network of clinics and research centers that would make Cognition Reborn accessible to more people. With each new partnership, the program expanded. Patients who had once thought they were too old to change now had access to a solution that could help restore their cognitive function and their sense of purpose. The success stories began to multiply, and soon, Margaret was speaking at national forums, working with lawmakers to pass legislation that would fund cognitive rehabilitation programs for older adults. As Margaret watched Cognition Reborn spread across the country, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. She had fought hard for this moment, and it was finally paying off. The impossible was becoming reality. But Margaret knew that this was just the beginning. The real work would continue, as the technology evolved, as the program expanded, and as society's attitudes toward aging continued to shift. The road ahead was long, but Margaret felt more confident than ever that the future she had fought for, the future of a world where age was not a barrier to transformation, was within reach. It was a future where everyone, regardless of their age, could continue to grow, learn, and contribute. And Margaret, with all the resilience she had cultivated over the years, would continue to lead the charge. She wasn't just advocating for a new technology, she was advocating for a new way of thinking about life, about aging, and about what it meant to truly live. Months turned into years, and the Cognition Reborn program was no longer a mere concept, it had become a movement, one that was redefining the very fabric of how society viewed aging and cognitive decline. Margaret had always believed that technology, when used thoughtfully, had the power to change lives, and now, standing at the forefront of this revolution, she felt the weight of that truth more than ever. The program was no longer a pilot, but a permanent fixture in the lives of thousands of older adults across the country. More clinics had adopted Neuralink's brain-computer interface, and the results were undeniable. Patients who had previously been told that their cognitive decline was irreversible were now able to regain memories, reclaim lost skills, and regain a level of independence they had thought was forever out of reach. And yet, with success came new challenges. Margaret had seen firsthand the skepticism that persisted in certain corners of the medical community. Despite the evidence of tangible progress, there were still those who questioned whether such technology could ever truly be a part of mainstream healthcare. There were ethical questions about the long-term effects of implanting a brain-computer interface into someone's mind. There were concerns about inequality, who would have access to this life-changing technology, and who would be left behind. Margaret's resolve had only grown stronger with each obstacle. She had learned, over the years, to use resistance as fuel for her drive, never letting the naysayers drown out the voices of those who had benefited from the technology. And for Margaret, those voices were the ones that mattered most. The success stories, the faces of those who had been given a second chance, were what kept her moving forward. One of the most powerful examples came from Henry, the man who had once thought his life was over when he had been diagnosed with early-onset dementia. When Henry first began his participation in the program, he had been a shell of the man he once was. He had struggled with memory loss, disorientation, and, at times, had become so frustrated by his cognitive limitations that he had withdrawn from the world around him. But after receiving the Neuralink implant and going through the cognitive rehabilitation program, Henry's transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Not only had his cognitive abilities been restored, but his zest for life had returned. He had taken up painting again, a hobby he had loved in his youth, and was reconnecting with friends and family he had lost touch with during his decline. He even volunteered at a local community center, sharing his story and encouraging others to take the leap. One afternoon, Margaret met with Henry at the community center to catch up on his progress. As they sat in a small, sunlit room filled with paintings that Henry had created, he smiled at her. "You know, Margaret," he said, his voice warm and full of gratitude, "I never thought I'd be here again. I thought the person I was, the person who could do the things I loved, was gone for good. But now, well, now I feel like I've been given a second chance." Margaret smiled back, her heart swelling. "You've always had that potential, Henry," she said. "You just needed the right tools to unlock it." Henry's story, along with countless others, had become the backbone of the Cognition Reborn campaign. With each success, more people began to see the potential of this technology. Families of older adults reached out, asking for information about the program, while healthcare providers saw firsthand the transformative effects it could have. The media began to take notice, and soon Margaret was invited to speak on national talk shows and write op-eds in major newspapers. Her message was simple but powerful: aging was not a time to be feared, it was a time to be embraced, to be fought for, and to be lived with dignity. Still, the road ahead was far from easy. The healthcare system was deeply entrenched in its ways, and many institutions were slow to adopt new technologies, especially those as radical as brain-computer interfaces. Margaret spent countless hours meeting with policymakers, insurance companies, and healthcare executives, pushing for the kind of change that was necessary to make this technology available to all. There were setbacks, resistance from the powerful forces of tradition, concerns over the cost of implementation, and, at times, political opposition to the widespread use of Neuralink's technology. But Margaret knew that the fight was worth it. One evening, after a particularly challenging meeting with a group of lawmakers who had been hesitant to pass a bill that would allocate federal funds for cognitive rehabilitation programs, Margaret found herself at a crossroads. She sat in her office, staring out the window at the city skyline, feeling the weight of the struggle bearing down on her. "What am I doing?" she asked herself. "Is this really worth it?" But as the sun set behind the buildings, casting a warm glow across the room, her thoughts turned to the patients. The Henrys, the Claras, the thousands of individuals whose lives had been changed. She thought of the woman in her 60s who had been able to go back to work after receiving the treatment, of the father and son who had reconciled after years of estrangement caused by the father's cognitive decline. The faces of these people flashed before her eyes, and she knew that this was more than just a personal crusade. It was about all of them, and the countless others who would benefit from this technology in the future. Margaret stood up, feeling the familiar fire in her belly. She had been at this crossroads before, and each time, she had chosen to continue fighting. There was no turning back. The next day, she received an unexpected call from Dr. Davis, who had been working alongside her on the clinical trials. "Margaret," he said, his voice filled with excitement, "I think we've hit a breakthrough. We've been running simulations on a new neural network design, and it looks like it could significantly enhance the cognitive recovery process for patients in the later stages of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "A breakthrough?" she asked, hardly daring to believe it. "Yes," Dr. Davis confirmed. "We're seeing improved memory retention and better motor function in patients who had previously shown limited response to the treatment. It's not perfect yet, but it's a massive step forward." Margaret felt a surge of hope. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for, the one that could propel the program to new heights. The new design could offer a solution for those who had been written off as beyond help, and it could bring them the same opportunities for restoration that had transformed Henry's life. She immediately began to strategize. She would need to gather the data, present it to the regulatory bodies, and work with the healthcare systems to ensure the new design could be incorporated into existing treatments. She reached out to her team at Neuralink, preparing for the next phase of expansion. And in the midst of it all, she found herself reflecting on how far she had come, from the woman who had once felt isolated and overlooked, to the advocate for change who was now standing at the helm of a revolution in healthcare. There were moments when she thought about her own journey, the years she had spent feeling invisible, waiting for a chance to prove that she still had something to offer. But now, as she looked back on everything she had accomplished, Margaret knew that she had found her purpose. And in helping others rediscover theirs, she had found her own. The fight wasn't over. There was still much work to do, still many barriers to break down, and still countless lives to transform. But as Margaret sat down at her desk, ready to take on the next challenge, she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she wasn't done yet. The world had changed, and she had changed with it. And the future, as always, was waiting for her to create it. Margaret's phone buzzed, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a text from Henry, one of the first people to join the Cognition Reborn program, now a close ally in the effort to bring cognitive restoration to older adults nationwide. His words were simple, but they brought a smile to her face: "I'm still painting. New piece coming soon. I'll send you a pic when it's done." The message was a reminder that progress, even in small ways, was something to be celebrated. Yet Margaret knew that, even as Henry's life had been transformed, there were still millions of others who were still waiting for their chance. Still waiting for the same opportunity to restore their lost cognitive abilities, to live fuller, more independent lives. While Henry's transformation was inspiring, it was also a stark reminder of the work that remained. It wasn't just about the science or the technology, it was about getting that technology into the hands of people who needed it most, those who had long been sidelined by the healthcare system, by age, and by society's indifference. That evening, Margaret sat down at her desk, reviewing her notes for an upcoming presentation. It was a pivotal moment. The first nationwide healthcare summit that would bring together stakeholders from all parts of the medical, technological, and policy-making worlds. The goal was simple: convince the key players to invest in expanding Cognition Reborn into a nationwide program, funded and supported by the government, healthcare providers, and the private sector. Margaret had spent months preparing for this moment, but now, as the time drew near, she felt the familiar nervous energy building up inside her. This wasn't just another meeting, this was her chance to change the entire trajectory of healthcare for aging Americans. For too long, the elderly had been treated as an afterthought when it came to cutting-edge medical innovations. But this technology was proof that there was another way, a way to empower older adults, to give them the tools to reclaim their lives. The morning of the summit, Margaret arrived at the convention center, her nerves steady but her heart racing with anticipation. As she walked into the bustling event space, she couldn't help but notice the wide range of people: medical professionals in their white coats, tech executives in their sleek suits, government officials scanning their schedules, and advocates from various organizations all vying for attention. It was a sea of change, a place where future-shaping decisions would be made, and Margaret was at the center of it all. After a few hours of networking and briefing, it was finally her turn to speak. The stage was set in front of hundreds of attendees, including policymakers, healthcare executives, and journalists. Margaret had been given a prime slot during the afternoon session, just after lunch, when people were either energized or beginning to tire. She knew that this was her moment to deliver a message that would stick. She stepped onto the stage, adjusting the microphone as the audience fell silent. "Good afternoon," Margaret began, her voice confident but warm. "I'm here today not just to talk about a technology, but about a new vision. A vision of a future where aging is no longer synonymous with decline, where older adults are no longer treated as if their best years are behind them. And yes, a vision where cognitive restoration through Neuralink's brain-computer interface is accessible to everyone who needs it." She paused, letting her words sink in. The audience was listening, some skeptically, others with curiosity. Margaret could feel the weight of her message, but she knew she couldn't afford to back down. "I've seen firsthand the difference this technology can make," she continued. "I've met people like Henry, a man who had lost so much to cognitive decline, and now, because of this program, he's painting again, connecting with loved ones, living the life he thought was lost forever. But Henry is not an outlier. He's a glimpse into what's possible for millions of people who are quietly struggling with the cognitive challenges that come with age. And it's not just about restoring memories, it's about restoring dignity." Margaret shifted in her stance, her eyes scanning the crowd. She could see the skepticism in some faces and the interest in others. She knew this wasn't just about the technology. It was about changing hearts and minds. "I understand the concerns," she continued. "This technology is new. It's uncharted territory. But we are at a crossroads in healthcare, particularly in how we address aging. The current model simply isn't sustainable. We can no longer accept that cognitive decline is an inevitable part of aging that must be lived with in silence. Cognition Reborn is not just a treatment, it's a new approach to aging that challenges all of us to rethink what's possible." Margaret clicked a button on the remote in her hand, and the room was filled with a slide that highlighted the program's data. The numbers were impressive. Patients who had participated in the program showed significant improvement in memory, cognition, and overall quality of life. Fewer hospital visits, fewer falls, and a reduced need for long-term care. "This isn't just a dream," she said, gesturing to the slide. "These numbers are real. These stories are real. We've already seen what's possible with Cognition Reborn, and we're just getting started. But to make this accessible to everyone, we need your help." Margaret's voice softened, as she spoke more personally. "I know that for many of us, aging is something to fear. We've been taught that with age comes loss, that we must accept that we'll fade into the background, become invisible. But that's not the reality. We don't have to accept this narrative. We don't have to wait for someone else to make the change. We can lead the way." Her words hung in the air, the room silent as the audience absorbed what she had just said. Then, slowly, hands began to raise, questions, comments, and inquiries about next steps. Margaret smiled, answering the questions with the same clarity and conviction she had carried with her through every obstacle. She spoke about the next phases of the program, the data that would continue to emerge, and the partnerships they were building with healthcare providers, insurers, and legislators to bring the technology to people who needed it most. When the session ended, Margaret was swarmed by attendees, some with questions, others offering their support, and many with interest in forming partnerships. There was a palpable energy in the air, a sense that something transformative was beginning. Margaret's heart swelled as she realized that her vision was starting to take shape, and the tide of change was finally turning. Over the next few weeks, the summit's buzz continued. News outlets began picking up the story, and the campaign to bring cognition reborn into the mainstream healthcare system gained momentum. New partnerships were formed with large-scale healthcare organizations, and the government began to explore funding for large-scale programs aimed at cognitive rehabilitation for older adults. Margaret's role had shifted. She was no longer just an advocate for technology, she was becoming the face of a cultural shift in how society viewed aging. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a text from Henry. It was an email from a major healthcare provider, asking for a meeting to discuss integrating cognition reborn into their national network. Margaret smiled as she opened the email, knowing that the future was unfolding before her eyes. It had taken years of hard work, setbacks, and relentless belief in what was possible. But Margaret had been right. Change was not just about technology, it was about the willingness to challenge the old narrative, to embrace the possibility of transformation at any stage of life. And now, thanks to her persistence and the power of Neuralink's brain-computer interface, older adults across the country would have a chance to reclaim their cognitive health and their lives. And Margaret knew that this was just the beginning. The future was wide open, and she would continue to fight for those who, like Henry, had been given a second chance. A second chance at life. The success of Cognition Reborn was not just a testament to the technology, it was a reflection of the resilience and determination of a generation that had often been overlooked. Margaret had become the beacon of hope for so many, but the truth was, she wasn't alone. The program's growth wasn't just about her. It was about the collective movement of people fighting to reclaim their futures. But the deeper Margaret delved into the expansion of Cognition Reborn, the more she realized that the battle for broader access to brain-computer interfaces was far from over. In fact, the biggest challenge had only just begun. The healthcare summit had sparked widespread interest, but it had also uncovered deep divisions. The world was on the precipice of a new era in medicine, and there were still those who resisted change. Critics pointed to the costs of implementation, while others questioned the long-term effects of the Neuralink technology. There were murmurs of fear, of hesitation, of people wondering whether this technology was a step too far. These were valid concerns, and Margaret knew she had to address them head-on if she was going to push this revolution forward. She had spent her days working with engineers, scientists, and policy advocates to draft a proposal that would make the technology more accessible. In the meantime, Henry's continued progress became a touchstone in their advocacy efforts. He had recently sent her a picture of his latest painting, a breathtaking landscape of the ocean, vibrant with color and texture. When Margaret looked at it, she saw not just the work of an artist, but the soul of a man who had been given the ability to see the world clearly once again. This was what she was fighting for, a chance for people like Henry to not only restore what they had lost but to rediscover parts of themselves they thought were long gone. One morning, as Margaret sat in her office preparing for another round of meetings, her phone rang. It was Dr. Davis, who had been working closely with her on the latest round of clinical trials for the Cognition Reborn program. "Margaret, we've got some new data coming in. And it's big," he said, his voice crackling with excitement. "We've been working on a more refined version of the neural interface, one that requires a less invasive procedure and could potentially double the recovery rate for patients in the advanced stages of Alzheimer's. This could change everything." Margaret's pulse quickened. "That's incredible. How soon can we present this to the public?" Dr. Davis paused, and Margaret could almost hear the wheels turning in his mind. It's not ready for public release yet, but I believe we're close. I need a few more weeks to gather all the data and make sure it's stable. But we're looking at a breakthrough that could make the program available to a larger swath of people. Especially those who previously wouldn't have been candidates for the treatment. Margaret couldn't hide the grin spreading across her face. The piece of the puzzle they had all been waiting for was falling into place. This new version of the technology had the potential to make Cognition Reborn even more accessible, reducing both the cost and the risks involved in the implantation process. And it wasn't just about accessibility, it was about impact. The more refined the technology became, the more lives it could touch, and the faster they could change the way the world viewed aging. But even as Margaret basked in the excitement of this potential breakthrough, she knew that there were still hurdles to overcome. This news was game-changing, but it would take time to integrate the new version of the interface into the program. It would require not just technical innovation but also the acceptance of an entire healthcare system that was often resistant to new, unproven methods. There were insurers who needed to be convinced, regulatory bodies that needed to approve the new design, and hospitals that had to be brought into the fold. Margaret spent the next few weeks in a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and strategy sessions. She met with insurance companies to discuss how they could incorporate Cognition Reborn into their coverage plans. She sat down with legislators to help them understand the transformative potential of the technology and why it needed federal funding. She spoke with hospital executives about training their staff to handle the new procedure. And all the while, she kept in close contact with Henry and the other participants in the program, sharing their progress and gathering their feedback. But there was one particular conversation that stuck with her, one that changed the way she thought about the future of the program. It happened during a dinner meeting with her longtime colleague and friend, Sarah, who had been working alongside her since the very beginning. "Margaret," Sarah began, her tone serious, "you know as well as I do that this technology is only as powerful as the mindset behind it. Cognition Reborn can help people restore their cognitive functions, but it won't do much if they don't believe they can be restored in the first place." Margaret frowned, unsure of what Sarah meant. "I'm not sure I follow." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her eyes thoughtful. "I mean that there's a mental barrier for a lot of people. They're so conditioned to believe that aging means inevitable decline, that they've been told their whole lives that their best years are behind them. Even with a program like Cognition Reborn, there's a mindset shift that needs to happen. People need to be willing to believe that change is possible." Margaret nodded slowly, taking in Sarah's words. She knew Sarah was right. The technology alone couldn't change the world. The people using it had to first believe that they could change. "I've seen it in the patients we've worked with," Sarah continued. "Some of them embrace the technology wholeheartedly, and they thrive. Others resist, even when it's clearly benefiting them. The mind is a powerful thing, Margaret. We have to help people not just heal their brains, but heal their beliefs about what they're capable of." That conversation stayed with Margaret as she moved forward. Yes, they were advancing the science. Yes, they were expanding access. But the real revolution had to start in people's hearts and minds. If she wanted Cognition Reborn to truly change the world, she would have to find a way to inspire people to believe in their own potential for transformation. Weeks later, Margaret returned to the community center where she had first met Henry. It was a small, bright space where she had spent many hours hearing the stories of those whose lives had been touched by the program. This time, however, she wasn't there just to observe. She was there to speak, to share her vision for the future of Cognition Reborn and to inspire the people who had already taken the first steps toward reclaiming their futures. As she stood in front of the group, she saw the same faces she had seen before, the hopeful, the skeptical, and the unsure. These were the people who needed to hear her message. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her responsibility. "This isn't just about technology," Margaret said, her voice steady. "This is about a mindset. It's about believing that no matter how old you are, no matter how many years you've lived, you are not beyond change. Cognition Reborn is here to help you reclaim your life, but you have to believe that it's possible. The biggest barrier we face isn't the technology, it's the belief that transformation is possible, even at an age when the world tells us we're too old for change. She paused, letting her words sink in. I want you all to think about the person you were before you ever heard about this program. The person you were before you thought your cognitive decline was inevitable. The person you were when you believed you were too old to start over. What if that person still exists? What if, with the right tools and the right mindset, you could rediscover that person? You can. The room was silent for a long moment, and then, one by one, the faces in the crowd began to soften. The resistance, the uncertainty, started to fade. Margaret smiled, knowing that the true work of transformation was just beginning. This was more than about science. It was about changing the way society viewed aging and, most importantly, changing the way individuals viewed themselves. The future was not defined by age, but by possibility. And Margaret would be there every step of the way to ensure that the doors of that possibility remained wide open. The months following that pivotal community gathering were a whirlwind for Margaret. She had succeeded in getting the world's attention, but now it was time to push the Cognition Reborn initiative into full motion. The momentum was building, but so were the obstacles. As Margaret had anticipated, the hardest part was not convincing the public or the media, it was shifting the entrenched systems that governed healthcare and technology. Hospitals, insurance companies, and regulators were slow to embrace change, especially when it came to something as groundbreaking as brain-computer interfaces. But Margaret was undeterred. She had lived through decades of societal inertia, seen the world change in small, incremental ways. She knew that real transformation didn't come easily, but it was possible if you were persistent enough to push through the walls of resistance. And so, she pushed harder than ever. She spent countless hours in conference rooms, on video calls, and in airports traveling from one meeting to the next. Every step was calculated, every conversation carefully crafted to chip away at the barriers that stood between the Cognition Reborn program and widespread implementation. Every time a skeptic questioned the technology, Margaret had an answer ready. Every time an insurance company balked at the cost, she brought out the data, the stories of patients whose lives had been transformed. Among the most difficult challenges were the concerns over privacy. The thought of a neural interface implant raised significant alarm bells for many, particularly in an era of ever-growing concerns about data security. People wondered who would own their thoughts, who would have access to their memories, and how their private mental health would be protected. These were real concerns that needed to be addressed, not brushed aside. Margaret knew that transparency and trust would be essential if they were going to push the technology forward. She found herself spending evenings with legal experts, working on policies and frameworks that would protect user privacy. It was a tightrope act, ensuring the technology's potential while safeguarding individuals' rights. But through those long discussions and planning sessions, Margaret felt the weight of her responsibility even more acutely. She wasn't just advocating for a new medical technology. She was advocating for a future where older adults could feel empowered rather than disempowered by the natural aging process. Henry, now a key ambassador for the Cognition Reborn program, continued to be her source of inspiration. He called her regularly, giving updates on his life, his artistic endeavors, and his thoughts on the program. He had become not just a patient but a symbol, a living testament to the fact that it was never too late to change. One day, as Margaret sat down to prepare for an upcoming panel discussion on aging and technology, Henry's name appeared on her phone. She answered with a warm smile, as she always did when she saw his number. "Margaret, I've been thinking a lot about what you said to us in the community center," Henry said, his voice as calm and measured as always. "About transformation being more than just the science. I think I finally get it. It's not just about the brain. It's about the spirit." Margaret leaned back in her chair, her eyes closing for a moment as she listened. "I'm glad you're feeling that way. This is the hardest part, Henry. People need to believe in their own potential for change. And sometimes, that's the hardest thing of all to get through to them." Henry chuckled softly. "You know, the hardest part wasn't the procedure. It wasn't even the recovery. It was the fear. The fear that this might not work, that I was too far gone. I've spent so many years believing that my best days were behind me, that I was already living in the past. But that moment when I picked up a paintbrush again. I can't even describe it. It was like I was seeing the world for the first time, like I had woken up from a fog. Margaret's heart swelled with pride. She'd heard these stories 100 times, but they never failed to inspire her. It's a powerful thing to rediscover yourself, Henry. And that's what we're doing here. We're giving people the chance to wake up from that fog. But it's not just the technology, it's the belief in the possibility of change. Henry was quiet for a moment. Then, he spoke again, his tone more serious. What you're doing, Margaret, it's more than just changing healthcare. You're changing the way we think about aging itself. We've been told for so long that age is a prison, that once we hit a certain number, our value starts to decline. But this is giving us a way out. It's giving us a future again. Margaret's eyes welled up with tears. It wasn't often that Henry got emotional, but his words hit her in a way that no amount of data or policy discussions ever could. This wasn't just about cognitive restoration, it was about giving people back their dignity. The dignity to live a life of their own choosing, no matter their age. As she wiped away a tear, she whispered, "You're absolutely right. This isn't just a program, it's a movement. And I'm going to make sure it keeps growing. I'm going to fight for this, Henry. For you, for all of us." After hanging up, Margaret felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. She had always believed in the power of change, but now she felt the weight of it more than ever. This was not just about convincing people to adopt new technology, it was about changing the way society viewed aging. It was about shifting the narrative from one of inevitable decline to one of potential and possibility. That night, as she sat down with her laptop to prepare her notes for the upcoming panel discussion, Margaret reflected on how far they had come. They had started with a vision, a simple idea that technology could be used to improve the lives of older adults, and now, that vision was becoming a reality. But she also knew that the battle was far from over. There would always be resistance. There would always be people who feared change, who saw it as a threat. But Margaret also knew that this was bigger than just cognition reborn. It was about shifting the cultural mindset that had so often sidelined older adults, about giving them the tools to reclaim their health, their agency, and their futures. And with each step, each new person who embraced the idea of cognitive restoration, they were one step closer to changing the entire landscape of aging in America. The next morning, as Margaret arrived at the venue for the panel discussion, she was greeted by a room full of journalists, policymakers, and industry leaders. The topic of the day was revolutionizing healthcare for older Americans, and Margaret was one of the featured speakers. As she walked to the stage, she noticed the familiar faces in the crowd, some skeptical, others hopeful. She took her seat at the panel table, surrounded by experts in healthcare and aging. The moderator introduced her last, and as she stood to speak, she felt a quiet confidence settling over her. This was her moment, not just to talk about the program, but to frame the larger conversation about what it meant to grow older in today's world. We often think of aging as a process of decline, Margaret began, her voice steady and clear. But what if aging didn't have to mean decline at all? What if the real question is not how to stop aging, but how to live our lives to the fullest at every stage? She paused for effect, letting her words sink in. What we're doing with Cognition Reborn is more than just restoring cognitive function. It's about giving people the chance to live with intention, to make decisions about their health, their bodies, their futures. And it's about recognizing that the narrative around aging is outdated. We're not done when we reach a certain age. We're just getting started. Her words were met with applause, a small but significant sign that the tides were beginning to turn. Margaret smiled as she sat down, knowing that each step forward, no matter how small, was pushing them closer to their goal. The world was finally starting to see what she had always believed, that the best days of life could come at any age. And Cognition Reborn was the key to unlocking that future. As the applause died down, Margaret allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The room was filled with policymakers, doctors, and technology experts, people who, just a year ago, would have questioned the viability of a program like Cognition Reborn. Now, they were listening. It was a step forward, a sign that society was beginning to take the idea of transforming aging seriously. Margaret had always known that the most difficult part wasn't going to be building the technology or getting the program off the ground, it was going to be changing the way people thought about aging. It was about confronting decades of cultural conditioning that told older adults they were past their prime, that their best years were behind them. And while the technology itself had sparked conversations, it was the emotional shift that was going to be the true revolution. "Margaret, that was powerful," a voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Dr. Thomas, a neuroscientist she had met earlier in the year, standing with a broad smile on his face. "I think you really struck a chord with the audience. People need to hear that. Aging doesn't have to mean giving up. You've created something that could change how we all see the future." "Thank you, Thomas," Margaret said, smiling back. "I think we've just started scratching the surface. But it's going to take more than just great technology to make this work. It's going to take a societal shift." The next few months were a whirlwind. The media began covering Cognition Reborn more frequently, with stories about the transformative impacts on older adults flooding the airwaves. Henry's story, in particular, had gone viral, drawing attention from around the world. His once skeptical children had publicly praised the program, and his artwork, an emotional symbol of his journey, was displayed in local galleries. His life, once defined by loss, was now one of renewal and growth. But even as the media painted an optimistic picture, Margaret knew the road ahead was still fraught with challenges. One of the largest hurdles now was figuring out how to scale the program. There were thousands of people who wanted access, but Cognition Reborn was still in the early stages of expansion, and the cost of the technology remained a significant barrier. Margaret and her team worked tirelessly to push forward. They partnered with academic institutions to launch new research initiatives, hoping to secure funding for further development. They also reached out to insurance companies to negotiate coverage for the program, knowing that getting it covered by major health providers would be key to widespread adoption. The program's success had opened the door for discussions, but Margaret was acutely aware that convincing these powerful entities would require more than just success stories, it would require evidence, data, and the ability to prove that the program wasn't just a one-off solution but a sustainable, scalable model. The stakes couldn't have been higher. There were lives at risk, including Henry's. The pressure mounted, but Margaret was resolute. She had witnessed firsthand how Cognition Reborn had restored dignity, purpose, and agency to older adults. She couldn't allow those on the margins of society to lose out simply because of the healthcare system's inertia. One afternoon, while reviewing the latest round of data from the trials, Margaret received a phone call from an unexpected source. It was Elon Musk. He'd been following the progress of Cognition Reborn closely and had reached out to express interest in collaborating on the next phase of the project. "I've been reading about the program," Elon's voice said on the other end, "and I think we're on the verge of something huge here. You're on the right track, but scaling this kind of technology is going to require more than just good intentions. It's going to take serious innovation and investment. I want to help. Let's talk about how we can make this work." Margaret's heart raced. The man who had redefined industries and revolutionized technology was offering to partner with her. The possibilities were endless, but the responsibility was immense. She knew that if she accepted his offer, it would push Cognition Reborn to new heights, but it would also open the door to a whole new set of challenges. Elon had the resources, the vision, and the reach to take the program global, but his methods were often bold, and controversial. She took a deep breath. "I'm listening," she said. Elon's enthusiasm was palpable. "I've always believed that the future of humanity lies in our ability to innovate and break through boundaries. Aging doesn't have to be something we fear, it can be something we embrace. Cognition Reborn has the potential to change the way we think about life itself. Imagine a world where everyone, regardless of their age, can have the tools they need to live a long, healthy, and productive life. That's what I want to help you build. Margaret thought carefully. She had always admired Elon's fearlessness, but she was also cautious. He had a reputation for pushing the envelope, sometimes without fully considering the consequences. But she had to admit that his commitment to innovation was exactly what Cognition Reborn needed. I appreciate your offer, Margaret replied, choosing her words carefully. I believe in what you're saying. But this is more than just about technology, it's about changing the way society views aging. We're up against a deeply ingrained narrative that says older adults are no longer valuable. If we're going to succeed, we need to approach this with sensitivity and responsibility. I'm not just looking for a financial partner, I need someone who understands the broader social implications of this work. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Elon responded. I get it. I've always said that the technology we create has to serve a higher purpose. If we're going to change the future, we need to think beyond just the products. But I think we're aligned. Let's figure out how we can take this vision to the next level. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, brainstorming sessions, and negotiations. Margaret and Elon's teams worked around the clock to iron out the details of their partnership. Elon's investment provided the financial backing to scale the program quickly, but he also pushed for greater transparency and efficiency in the implementation process. He insisted that the program not just be for the wealthy or privileged but be accessible to everyone. The partnership meant that Cognition Reborn could move forward faster, but it also meant that Margaret had to work even harder to ensure the program stayed true to its original mission. The work was exhausting, but it was also exhilarating. Margaret found herself waking up each day with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that they were on the verge of something world-changing. And as the weeks passed, it became clear that their partnership with Elon Musk was going to change not just healthcare, but society itself. Meanwhile, Henry continued to thrive. He had recently started mentoring others in the program, sharing his story with newly enrolled patients. His journey had inspired so many people, but it was his newfound sense of purpose that resonated most deeply. He was no longer just a patient, he was an advocate, a symbol of what was possible when technology and the human spirit intersected. One evening, as Margaret sat at her desk reflecting on all they had accomplished, she received another call from Henry. Margaret, he said, his voice warm with emotion. I've been thinking a lot lately. About how far we've come. About how much Cognition Reborn has given me back, not just my memory, but my ability to live fully again. I don't think I would have ever believed this was possible if I hadn't gone through the program. And now, I want to give that same gift to others. I want to be part of this revolution, Margaret. I want to help people realize that it's never too late to change. Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes. This was why she had dedicated herself to this cause. It wasn't just about the technology. It was about giving people the tools to reclaim their lives, to redefine their futures. And Henry's words were a powerful reminder of what they were all fighting for. You already are, Henry, she said softly. You're changing the world. And as she looked ahead to the future, Margaret knew that they were only just getting started. The revolution was unfolding, one life at a time. And Cognition Reborn was leading the charge. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?